executive director of the Cyber Institute for Church Ministry, where he works to promote healthy growth of churches and Christian leaders through the Institute's web resources, special events, and consultancy. Located at Abilene Christian University, the Cyber Institute is named after the late Charles Seibert. I'm sure a lot of you knew Charles, former ACU faculty member who was known to many as the church doctor because of his dedication to helping congregations weather challenges. Carson is also an associate professor of practical theology in the Graduate School of Theology there at ACU. He has degrees from Oklahoma Christian University, his Master of Divinity from Harding School of Theology, and his Doctor of Ministry is from ACU. And he's been a preacher for over 30 years, so just like I mentioned earlier with regard to Jim, this is somebody who knows the academic world, but also has so much experience and is an expert in congregational ministry. So Carson is going to be speaking on crisis or opportunity. Yes, good question. Framing the church's life and mission in a new season. So let's welcome Carson Reed.
Well, thanks, Keith, and it's a delight to be with you all today. And I just want to say how honored I am to be a part of this this program today from the Center for Christian Studies. I'm excited about the launch and the development of the Center for Christian Studies and its work of bridging the gap between the academy and the life of the church. It's something that obviously is dear to my heart, because that's what Jim and Jeremy, I, Keith, what you all are doing is very much a part of the lifeblood of my own experience and my own commitments to see the academy serve the church. And so I'm glad to see you all here, and I'm delighted to be a part of this. Just thinking about all the connections here. 30 years, Jim, I remember being back in Indiana, and you were in Alabama, and I remember phone calls back in the 80s. And Jeremy, of course, is deeply involved in congregational life in a city that I know and love very dearly in Oklahoma City. So it's just a joy to be here together. So I am, among other things, director of the Cyber Institute. I just would say there's some brochures about the Institute laying out here on the table. Please pick one of those up. So you'll be able to see some of the things that we're doing and involved in. The next big event we've got is down in Houston, which is 3 hours from here. We've got something called Elder Link, an event coming, I think it's February 19, and we invite you to come and join us there for that day. For a day not unlike today of asking questions about leadership. So just a little brief commercial there, as it were, as we together seek to serve God's purposes in the world. I got to stand up here, don't I? Okay. Crisis or opportunity? The question. I'm going to come down clearly on one side of that in about 30 seconds. So I realize that's not a very good rhetorical question. It's opportunity. That's what I want to say. Not because of who we are, but because of who God is. And so we'll get there pretty quick. But the first thing I really want to begin talking about here is disruption. We've already heard some of this today, but I want to speak about it more fully. For the last 2 years or so, we've been living in the world of pandemic, and we've heard the word unprecedented an unprecedented amount of times. Strike it from the dictionary, right? But crisis, right? Disruption. And certainly, yes, right? We've had to learn to be adaptable in all kinds of incredible ways. I'm a university professor. I direct a doctoral program. It has jumped through more hoops and shifts and changes over the last 2 years than you can hardly imagine. I just finished a program last week of doing an online doctoral seminar by Zoom that went into the night because students from Australia to Canada and the Ukraine were a part of it. And people are, gathering together on different days of the week on Zoom, right? It's tomorrow in Australia right now, for example. And it will be tomorrow too there. It's a crazy time, right? It's a crazy time. And there's disruption everywhere. And so I'm acknowledging that. I want to acknowledge that. I know you know that, but here's the theologian critique that I want to bring into that. The pandemic didn't start that. As Christian people, we are living in the death and dying of Christendom. And what the pandemic has done is sort of done what I would call, it's been an apocalyptic moment for us. I'll tell you what I mean by that in a moment. The shifts that are taking place in our culture began. We could find any kind of places to point at that. I'm going to go with Will Willimon here for a moment, who said 25 years ago that it happened for him in 1968 in the little town in North Carolina where he grew up, when the local movie theater decided to open up on Sunday nights and show movies, and he, as a teenager, had to make a choice between whether to go to youth night at the local Methodist church or go to the movies. That's when the kind of disruption that we're attending to in our day today began, where the world of a Christendom, where the church and the culture and society sort of ran on the same set of rails. And we've been living in that for as long as many of you are alive. We've been in that kind of mode. And if we got back at a 35,000 foot level, we would see that there's a significant shift taking place in our world with regard to Christian faith. The last time we'd find this would be to go back to, I don't know, Martin Luther. It's a 500 short of year shift that we are living in the middle of. So that gives you a point of view about the pandemic is really no big deal. It really isn't. It really isn't in the scheme of God's activity in our world. It's not, as I like to say to a lot of people, this is not God's first pandemic. Right? Famine, war, and pestilence. I think that's kind of what we're in, right? And God's been through this before. But there's a significant thing going on. And so I want us to acknowledge the reality that we're in an apocalyptic moment. That is to say, I'm not talking about zombies here. I'm talking as in the idea of apocalyptic revealing, a disclosure, right? Right? The revelation, apocalypse, the disclosure. What's happening in the pandemic is it's disclosing how fragile and shifting the tectonic plates really are in our culture. Are you following me? And so we're really up against something bigger than just how do we, broadcast live streaming on our worship services on Sunday morning. That's something we've got to work on, or we've got to think about, and we've got to reflect on our practices around that and what that might mean for us as communities of faith. But hey, there's much bigger fish to fry in this time and space for Christian leaders. And that's what I want us to kind of move into and think about and reflect about here a little bit today. So I've got a few theological assumptions that I'm working with. And I want to move through these quick. These are not all the assumptions that I'm coming to the table with, but some that I think are germane for us to name today with regard to where we're at in this time and space. One is that I want to make the claim that God is present and at work. I'm assuming that. No more functional atheism here, folks. One of the products of modernity has been that is, over the last 100 years, that human beings have come to be able to have more and more control over more and more things, right? And in so doing, what we've basically done, according to Charles Taylor, a Canadian philosopher, is we've been able to kind of push God out to the fringes. It's conceivable today to imagine a world where God does not exist. In 1500, you could not do that. Everybody assumed that, right? That God existed. In fact, that he was at work. In fact, he might be work in the plague in ways that are sort of dark and scary. But But we live in a world now where God is not a part of the equation. This is the kind of world we're in. And I'm coming to say, no, let's set aside our modern sort of notions and actually make the claim that God is present and he is at work. And we need to begin to act like he is present and at work. And this is a problem for American Christianity, both on the right and the left. On the left, and both expressions are, we've got to control, we've got to figure out the course and the narrative of things in our culture. And so we've got a progressive wing of Christianity and an ultra-right wing of Christianity, and both are pressing to say, we will control the national narratives. We will control the conversations in our public spaces. And I want to say, wait a minute, what if we just decided that actually God was in control of all of that, and we take a little different posture? We'll talk more about that later. Another thing to say about that goes just a little deeper is to say that God has a preferred future for your congregation. He has a preferred future for your congregation. It always strikes me every time I read Paul's letter to the Philippians, where he will say these simple words, and I want to say them over you all today, that speak to this in a very profound way. He says, I thank my God every time I remember you, constantly praying with joy in every one of your prayers for all of you, because of our sharing in the gospel from the first day until now. I am confident of this, that the one who began a good work among you will bring it into completion in the day of Jesus Christ. That our conviction, my assumption today, is that God has a preferred future for your community of faith. Large, small, wherever it's at, city, country, doesn't matter. God is at work in these spaces. And thirdly, or nextly in all of this, that God is God's actually working in disruption. In fact, sometimes I think sometimes I would assert that God disrupts, but certainly God is in disruption. It's in those cracks and fissures that suddenly, in apocalyptic moments, where God discloses himself if people are paying attention. Now, this could get into a lot of theological conundrums about, does God cause disruption, or does God, I'm not into theodicy here today. We'll ask Keith Stanglin to talk about that at some point. What I want to do is simply say that in the midst of all the disruption we're experiencing, there are places for us, if we're paying attention, to see God at work. I'm doing a lot of work in Acts right now, so I'm going to mess around in Acts some. It's always struck me as really remarkable that in Acts chapter 16, Luke and Paul are traveling around, and I'm reading here from Luke 16:6. They went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia because they were forbidden by, does anybody remember this? Who forbade them? Holy Spirit, to speak the word in Asia. And when we came opposite Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So passing by Mysia, they went to Troas. And during the night, Paul had a vision. And here was this Macedonian call, right? Come over to Macedonia and help us. Paul and his party are being disrupted at every turn. And what's remarkable is they're paying attention to it. This is what I want us to encourage us to begin to practice, a kind of disposition to pay attention to what God might be doing in these gaps and fissures in this time of disruption that we find ourselves. And it happens to him actually in Philippi, right? Paul's normal mode of operation is to find a synagogue. No synagogue in Philippi. Let's go find something else. Well, I can't find that. They finally show up at the river, and it's not a group of Jewish men out there worshiping. It's a women's Bible study, for crying out loud. Another disruption. Well, the next thing you know, we got Lydia in the story. You know this, but I'm just pointing out that if you read through the book of Acts, disruption is on every page of this text. And what's happening? God is breaking in, God is directing, and the disposition of the characters in the book of Acts are one of responding to God's prior action, God's action as it unfolds and all of that. I'm making an assumption about the church. I don't think I need to say more about that. And now let me make a couple of sociological notes here that are in what we're attending to. That we are, in fact, in a secular age. Let's just name it. That this is not a Christian nation. Did I just say that? Okay, I did. We are living in an age of secularity. And it's only going to get more so. And so I want to break in here and just kind of do a little reality check. Charles Seibert, who I find myself living and echoing with, one of his favorite things was to say that reality is your friend. Thanks, Jim. I knew you'd know that. Reality is your friend. We've got to face what reality looks like. And his other one was, denial ain't just a river in Egypt. Right? We've got to take a hard look at what reality is. Our churches are grayer and smaller. I would think that 90% of them are that way. It was 80% before the pandemic. So what do we? Yeah. That returning to normal is not merely just something that we. It may be understandable to us, this desire to return to something that we remember in our past fondly. But I want to suggest that that's not only not desirable, it's actually impossible. You can't step into the river again. It's a different river. And we've got to negotiate our nostalgia for something that once was for something else. And that's what we want to try to attend to a bit here today. There is, just because we are human beings, a desire for the status quo. We long for what is comfortable for us. And we resist that shifting and changing, and yet that shifting and changing is being forced on us, and we have to be thinking about something new. And so what lies ahead for us as a people is what I would call, what scholars call liminal space. That may be a $64 word for some of us. It's sort of like crossing across the threshold from one room into another. But it's that in-between space that we're talking about. We're not in what we were, 1968, and we're not fully into whatever is coming. We're in an in-between space. And in that in-between space, which is by its very definition uncertain and ambiguous and unclear, then we're going to have to come up with some new ways of behaving and living. And that's part of what I want to be able to attend to. There's some really hard work for us to do in our churches and on ourselves in that liminal time, in that liminal space. It strikes me that it took about a year, let's say, to get the Israelites out of Egypt, but it took about 40 years to get Egypt out of Israel. Right? Well, the wilderness was a liminal space. It was a time of transition. It was getting a people to be a people, right? And we're in that kind of wandering around time. And so using that as a bit of a metaphor that may be helpful for you to think about what's going on in your congregation and what you find yourself wrestling with. Okay, so having said some of those kinds of things, I want to talk about some principles here that might be helpful to us as we move in more deeply into this time and in space. One of those is to simply say we are feeling keenly loss during this time. And it is right for us to acknowledge that. In fact, we need to name the grief and lament, and to acknowledge that things have changed, that we have lost something. To act as if nothing had happened does not serve us well. And so in your place and context, yes, acknowledge we are not who we once were. And to be able to grieve over that. So that's one thing we need to do. And then there's a second kind of move that I want us to do to kind of prep for what I think are more proactive or constructive moves. The second thing that I want to suggest that needs to happen, and I'm speaking here today to leaders, so I want to make this very, 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 very clear, that the call and the challenge I would lay upon you and your hearts is that your primary identity is one of being a disciple of Jesus Christ and not as leader. Your identity, who you are, is determined by the fact you went into a watery pool and were immersed into the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Leadership is always a secondary activity. I'm holding up here. Leadership is something you do. It's not who you are. Leadership is an action that you are called on perhaps by gifts and calling and the moment. You're the one standing there, so you got it. It's yours. It's like Gandalf and Frodo in the mines of Moria. Help me out. Thank you. Why did the ring come to me? Well, it just came to you. So, take it forward. Leadership is something that we do or are called on to do, but who you are is that you are a daughter or a son of God's. And if we're not attending to our fundamental identity, if we don't know that and remind ourselves of that and practice the sorts of things that Jim was sharing with us this morning in the fostering of that, then we're off to a bad start here. We've got to understand ourselves, because what will be needed in this new time and season more than ever are non-differentiated leaders. People who know themselves and who know the God who knows them and who are in living relationship, that Christ lives in them, that they are led by the Spirit. Oh, the Scripture is full of language for this, isn't it? At every turn. And that's who I am. That's what I'm grounded in that reality, not in the fact, well, I'm the leader, I'm the pastor, I'm the minister, I'm the elder, I'm the whatever, and I've got to figure this all out, or it's all on me. No, it's actually all on God. It's really God's. It's God's church, right? It's God's action that we're following. So I really want to say that early on. This is sort of if you haven't connect the dots, I'm saying listen to what Jim said this morning. That's what I'm saying. We've got to attend to that. And then I want to move more to some constructive work here. So back to basics. I don't know how to do this well. The only way I know to do it, because I'm a Bible teacher, is to do some Bible teaching. So I'm going to take us into Matthew for just a brief moment, and I'm going to just say to you, as I set this up, and you may wonder, this guy is really, really crazy, but I'm just going to make the assertion that the Gospel of Matthew was written not so that we could do Christmas plays. I'm sorry to disappoint you, the Magi and all of that. It was actually written as a training manual for late first century church leaders. And Matthew wrote it hanging out in a large urban city of the day called Syria, or a community of the country of Syria, a city called Antioch. And he was writing to sort of prepare a new generation of leaders. Now, we could talk offline about why I would make those set of assumptions, and I can give you a bibliography so you can go find scholars who will back me up on this. So I'm reading Matthew as if it's a training manual, and we're going to have to look. So we're going to look for some clues. So in Matthew chapter 4, verse 23, there is a summary statement, just sort of an innocuous summary statement. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in the synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. Huh, okay, so that's what he was doing. Okay, great. And we keep on reading. And then we get over to about chapter 9, verse 35, and Matthew says, "And Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness." And we just kind of keep right on reading. Huh. Well, actually, church, what is being signaled to us, if we were first century listeners to this, is what scholars would call an inclusio. And it's sort of like speech communications 101. You tell the folks what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what they told them. And we just saw the first and third movements of that in 4:23 and 9:35. Guess what happens in the middle of that? He's unpacking three things. He's talking about Jesus teaching and Jesus kingdom announcing and Jesus healing. And I'm not going to take the time to unpack all that, but I'll give you a clue. Can you think of anything between 4:23 and 9:35 that might look remotely like anything Jesus taught? Sermon on the Mount. Right? You got 3 loaded chapters heavy with content of Jesus teaching. And chapter 8 has 5, Matthew's very programmatic about this, 5 stories that talk about and announce the way in which God is declaring his presence, his kingdom coming. There are 5 stories there. And guess what? Chapter 9 has 5 more stories that talk about the way in which Jesus heals. And then, you know what Matthew's doing? He says in 9:35, that's what Jesus does. Now, here's what Matthew is doing. I'm cutting to the chase. He is informing his community of leaders. You want to know what the community of Jesus looks like? It's a community of people who are formed by Jesus' teaching, who are finding ways to announce the approach and the coming of God's reign, rule, presence, kingdom. And it's a community of people who are embodying the healing work of Jesus. That's what he's doing. And actually, that's what then we see in chapter 11 begins to happen. He sends out the limited commission, and guess what they're doing? They're doing 2 of those things. They're healing, and they're announcing the kingdom. And you have to kind of drift all the way to the end of the Gospel of Matthew into what we call the Great Commission to hear about the teaching piece. But it's all there. It's all there. Now, I know this kind of oversimplifies things, and yet I think we need to kind of think simply. But if we want to embody life with what God is doing in the world, we're going to have to attend to those 3 very basic things. That is to say that we're going to be involved in and asking the question, how are we forming Christ community, Christian community? And we've got to go back to basics in our teaching. Now, when I say back to basics, when I say this in some churches in my consulting and preaching and work across the country, they go, "Oh, you mean," and they went, I remember back in the 70s, we had this preacher who gave these great sermons on hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. And I go, whoa, 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 whoa. And then others will say, well, what do you mean basics, right? What do you mean by basics? Well, we could probably start with the Sermon on the Mount and not be too far off. Now, there's a lot of stuff we could say here. We could talk a little bit about the way in which we inculcate the core of the Christian faith to another generation of believers. One of my greatest fears, folks, in fact, this may be my greatest fear, for the church in America is that the church in America ceases to know what it means to be distinctly Christian. And that means that we've got to recover, to pass on as Paul passed on in 1 Corinthians 15, pass on the core of the faith, the nature of God, that Jesus came, did ministry, was crucified, buried, rose again, and ascended into heaven, and he's coming again. The presence of the Spirit, the work of the church, right? You could find this you could find it in the Apostles' Creed, right? there's something about the core of the faith that we need to practice inculcating in ourselves and in our people. And creating and fostering community around those things. And so a simple question might be, how are you doing on that in your church? On a scale of 1 to 5. How are we doing with that kind of work? The second thing that we see here out of Matthew's work is this announcing God's arrival, the coming of the kingdom, the nature of God's presence. If there's anything clear in the Gospel of Matthew, it is that the kingdom is about the arrival of God, and what happens in our world when God shows up. From the very beginning of Matthew, where we're told that Jesus' name is not only Jesus, it's also Emmanuel, which means God with us, to the very end of the book of Matthew. And when Jesus says, are you ready for this? You see another inclusio, perhaps? And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. That to the core of the announcement of the people of God is that God is arriving in our world. He's showing up. He's showing up. For those of you who like to read, go read some Andrew Root on this, a practical theologian who's doing a lot of work around this notion of how do we engage in a secular world, in a secular society. Our culture is dying, is longing to hear a word about God showing up. Even this is the thing that Root will talk about, echoing Taylor, echoing James K.A. Smith, is that we're living in a time where our culture says there's no God, and yet so many people go around with this haunting, longing sense of, boy, I wish there was a God. Does this make sense to you? There's this, it's a haunting. It's like the world is no longer enchanted. God is not here, but boy, I wish that the world was enchanted. That's why we believe in superhero. That's why we go watch Marvel movies in this cinematic universe, which I'm having to endure a second time because my son, who's in the military, is home for a month, and we're watching all this again. Why do we? Well, it's because we think and hope and long that the world has some enchantment in it, where good will triumph over evil. And you know what? As Christian people, we're the ones saying, hey, yeah, it really is. There really is a world of enchantment. It's this person that's been revealed in Jesus Christ. And so to be able to announce that our practices, what we do as a community of faith, is to say, God is here. God is present. He is arriving. He's coming in, even into the darkest of places. This is the work of since I'm halfway there, I'll go ahead. Jürgen Moltmann, the German theologian, says that we've got to pay attention to the Missio Dei of God, the mission of God. But you can't talk about the Missio Dei of God, the mission of God, without talking about the Passio Dei of God, the suffering of God. Because it's in the suffering of God, the passion, right, the death, burial, and burial of Jesus Christ, of God entering into death itself, talk about disruption, that we recognize just how fully and completely God is present in human experience. So announcing God's arrival, the idea of proclaiming the kingdom is not just, this is not about Sunday morning sermon. This is about a way of living as a community of people. Now, if you're a preacher, this needs to be, right? This is part of what we preach week in, week out. But it's not just limited to the 27-minute sermon that's preached. It's about a way of being as a community of people. All right, I've probably said enough there. What was the third thing? Jesus went about healing. So a third move for a church is to pay attention to in this time and place, it seems to me, is, are we practicing healing? Are we agents of God's healing? Are we finding ways to bring wholeness into a world that's full of brokenness? what's that look like in our space? Now I'm injecting a couple of words to that. Hospitality here. What's the other word? Okay, shalom. Okay, wholeness, completeness. I don't think any of us are going to get confused that we are the ones who actually heal people. The Greek original word is the word we get therapy from. We practice therapy. We can, in some ways, do that. But I think the assertion for us is that God is at work bringing wholeness and healing and completeness. And that's to be our disposition as well as a people of God. And so I'm suggesting here this morning that these are three things that you might be doing to frame this time of moving more deeply into that. How are we doing? How are we doing with forming people as disciples of Jesus Christ? And asking, how's our worship service doing that? How is our Bible school program doing that? How is our small group ministries doing that? In fact, you need to be asking how everything you do is doing that. I was talking to one group once about, how your worship service should be helping form people to be like Jesus. And they're like, well, that's not what we do. And I said, then why do you do what you're doing? Well, everything we do in worship ought to be forming us and shaping us. And announcing the kingdom, our practices and our ministries, are they in fact declaring that God is present in our world? And thirdly, are we practicing, is our life together demonstrating God's graciousness, God's healing, God's wholeness, and bringing into some little dark place in our context something of the goodness of God, the wholeness of God, and all of that. Okay, now that's kind of the big three. Then I want to say some things about how we might go about doing that. Here's something that we've got to steel ourselves against. And what I'm about to say has always been true. It's just that we've gotten away with it. When I was early in ministry, in fact, I remember going, well, first it was, if you're as old as I am, you remember what everybody was doing was flocking to go see what Willow Creek was doing, Bill Hybels was doing. Well, if we could just get that program, then we'll figure it out and we'll bring that back and drop that in on our church. And then it was Warren. And let's run out to Saddleback. Let's go to the West Coast. Besides, it's sunnier out there. We can spend a week out there learning some stuff. And now everybody, and this is not a critique of Hybels or Warren or Stanley, because now we're all going to Atlanta to find out about Orange and how to do cool, hip things there. There are cool, hip things happening. That's all good. But here's the problem. You're not in Atlanta, Georgia. I ministered in Atlanta, Georgia in the shadow of Stanley's church. I know the underside. I know they were doing good things. I also know the underside of that. And we need to quit trying to think that somehow or another I can find the perfect model out there somewhere that I can bring in on our church. You need to inhabit your own context. You've got to know your own context. You need to live and work in your own context. And now this is being forced on us in profoundly and powerful ways. There was a time when we had mega churches, and then we had large regional churches, and then we had smaller community churches. But those days are passing. We'll continue, as I look at the future, still see mega churches. More power to them, but I don't think any of you are in mega churches here today. So I'm not talking about mega churches. In Churches of Christ, we only got a handful of them. That's not what they will find their way forward in their own way. For most of us, we're in churches of 50 or 100 or 500 or maybe 1,000 in here. And what I'm saying to you is that you're going to have to learn your own context and ask, what is it that God wants us to do in our space? And the thought that somehow or another we can have the coolest music program and draw people from all over the city of Austin to come to our church and drive across 45 minutes of traffic to show up on Wednesday nights, that day is gone. It's gone. You need to say, God has planted us in this space, in this neighborhood. Or if you're in a small town, some of you are in small towns, the good news is you're set sweet. You've got the whole town to minister to. Go for it. What's going on in your town? Live in that town. Work in that town. Get involved in the life of that town or that neighborhood or that community, that district of an urban setting. Whatever it is, one of the brightest things we're seeing in new church plants is what's called parish evangelism or parish ministry. It's the old English kind of thing where there's well, I guess you can go to Louisiana, right? Sorry, a little mind went through my brain there. Parish, a distinct geographic region that this is our community, and we're serving this community. And it kind of doesn't matter whether they go to our church building or not. They're our people. And get to know and love them and find ways of walking alongside them in life. That's your calling. That's your place. What is that place? And yours is going to be different than the guy or gal that's sitting next to you. That's why we can't just play the cookie cutter, drop the thing in, because we're all in distinct places. And that's why we've got to pay attention to what God might be saying to us in those places. I've been debating for some weeks whether it was time to toss this thing. It may be. Another thing that I want to lay out here to suggest is that in this time, I'm inviting you to think about what's the compelling narrative. What's the compelling narrative for your context? How is it that God may be calling your particular community of faith to embody and live out God's preferred future? Because it's going to be different in your church than it is your church, your church, your church. Now, the master narrative is still the same, right? It's bound up in God's story in and through Jesus Christ. But it's going to look very different in Austin than it is in Leander or Lampasas or Bastrop. Or from where I'm in Abilene, Texas, right? We're all in these different places, but what's that narrative look like? And that narrative is asking, what is it that God is inviting our community to look like as we move into the future? And what are the steps that we need to be doing today that might prepare us for what is out there beyond us? Now, this is not an easy thing because particularly right now, we're living in kind of a hunkered down kind of state. I'm actively in about 10 churches right now doing consulting, and 8.5 of them are churches that are inwardly focused. 7.5. What I'm about to say here is that we've got to move from thinking about ourselves to thinking about God's purpose. Because if I just dwell on my own navel and think about myself, I become a narcissist. And we only exacerbate the decline and the grayingness of our churches. And we're living over and against our commitment that God is actually active and present. And so what I'm talking about here is having mission trump maintenance. Mission trumps maintenance. That there's this outward sort of frame that we're going to attend to. And that means that we're going to be inviting not only ourselves but our church to look beyond ourselves. Elvis has left the building, and so must the community of faith. This is not a time to say, well, how can we find 6 new ways to get people to come to our building? It's probably time to say, what are the 2 ways in which we're going to go beyond our building? There's sort of a shift. I was talking to a leading younger mission person who does work on the East Coast in large urban areas, and I said, we were talking about this. When he's working with people, and they say, well, this really intrigues me. Can I come to church with you? And you know what he says? He says, no, you can't come to my church. But if you'll get a group of your friends and family together at your apartment, I'll come and we'll start church at your place. Do you hear the shift in modality in that? Of coming into other places and being the guest in other places rather than always being the host. Jesus pulls that move actually on the road to Emmaus, doesn't he? Right? He comes in after that 7-mile journey and sits down with the two cats there, and they're about to have an evening meal, and Jesus breaks bread and blesses it, and suddenly the guest becomes the host. There's a place and a time for us to be guests, and we're going to need to find ways that allow us to imagine what it means to encounter folk who are other than us, different than us in all of this. And there's a need for us, of course, then to nurture a vision, a sense of a pathway that will move us toward God's preferred future. The way I like to think about this is if the compelling narrative of what God's preferred future is, if we're thinking about a map and we talk about God's preferred future and we think about it as that God's preferred future for the congregation that I'm a part of is Denver. I'll just pick a place. Then the vision is, how do we get, since we're in Austin, how do we, and our congregation metaphorically is in Austin, then how do we get from where we are today, Austin, to Denver? What's the vision? What route do we take? Do we take, I-35 to Dallas? Or are we going to go cutting across country and go through Abilene? That's a good, I highly recommend it. Come through Abilene. Or how do we get there? Right? There's multiple paths, but what is the path that God is inviting us into to fully participate? And that kind of work is the work that I would begin to invite you to think, to pray about and to engage in as you begin to try to frame what the life and mission for your church might look like in a new season. I could say a whole lot more, and there are slides here on this slide deck, but I think I'm just going to land the plane right there and give us a few minutes to have some Q&A, right? Keith, we've got about 15 minutes or so?
Yeah, a little less.
Okay. So I landed the plane. Whew, I've taxied up. What comment, question, what does this evoke for you? I'm just trying to lay out a bunch of stuff here. Yeah, Joe.
Of course, you highlight the graying and aging of our church.
Yeah.
You also highlight the need for us to inculcate, as you said, to the next generation, our core faith. That's a big question. What should we be thinking about there?
Yeah. Part of it, I think, is that is being able to empower younger generations to take more and more of a lead in our congregations. I was working with a church not long ago, and there were, I'll just tell this story. I'm sitting with a group of elders, and they're kind of whining about the fact there are fewer young people. And one of the elders in this church, this is a church in a state to the north of us, said, I don't know what the deal is. He said, when I was 30 years old, I was given the task of being the song leader for our church. And he said, I introduced our God, He's alive, and he started, 720. He started naming all these things. And I said, and you're still the song leader at age 70, at age 68 or 67, whatever it was. Where's the 30-year-old leading your worship services? Why don't you pass that on? And he didn't like that very much. The other elders were going, So part of it, it is a difficult thing. I want to acknowledge that. But I would say part of our step is just simply, are we passing on to younger people in our churches responsibility and inviting their wisdom. So I think part of this, things are kind of going down, and we tend to want to hold on to stuff rather than let go. So we're forgetting that actually this is God's church. Relinquishing. That would be a quick, very simple little piece.
And of course, I got to say, when it comes to thinking through, like, as you said, the post-Christian era of America has come.
Yeah.
We're kind of even past that, I think, at this point. But like you said, secular age of where we are in the culture and the world, and you're trying to talk to congregations about, hey, but we've got to be outreach focused. We've got to be outside the building. How do we keep people encouraged to do that? Because so much of what the more and more they talk about their lives with Christ, even if they're out serving, but still it seems like every time the door is being slammed in their face. How do we kind of keep that motivation going, especially in the age of the last 2 years?
Right. Modernity has gotten a greater hold of us in the church than we are even able to recognize. And it's kind of like the frog in the kettle, right, that gets turned up by degree. And when I was a kid, I played baseball as a kid. I don't know about you, but if there was never a game on Wednesday night, and if there was, I wasn't going. But sometime after that, by the time my kids were kids, we were going. Now, boy, I want to be careful. I'm not trying to create sort of a rules, legal kind of thing about faith here. But there's been this slow shift in our culture. So now we're living in an environment where our congregations, we ourselves have so many options by which we can occupy our time, and so many commitments that we can choose and pick and choose. Well, I'll let you know whether or not I'm coming to small group Bible study on Tuesday night, Tuesday afternoon, because we're kind of weighing our options. It's like maybe something else will come, or there's so much going on at work that we're trying to do all things, and so there's and this is a cultural thing within our communities of faith that we've got to attend to, of creating a culture where the thing is our faith, rather than all these many things sitting alongside our faith. Now that's a really big thing to attend to, and I think it starts kind of simple and one by thinking about some of the things we've been talking about here. What does it mean to truly be Christian? And rather than us rail about the culture that's pressing in on us or has in fact infected us, we're all carriers of this. I'm a carrier of it. That what I want to say to us about culture is that as the communities of faith, we create culture too. And we've got to pay attention to that creation of culture that we're participating in. Are we creating the kind of culture that winsomely invites people into a different kind of living? Maybe one more comment or question here, and then I want to re-land the plane. It was a touch and go. Drop down and we're back up. Yeah, Todd.
Just a hazard of being a librarian. You mentioned roots, and I know you've got a fairly extensive bibliography.
Yeah, I'm thinking about The Pastor in a Secular Age in particular. There's a trilogy that he's published in the last 4 years, and that's the middle one. There's one about faith formation, which we talked about this morning, was the first one. Secular Age is the second one. The third one's about, I went mind blank. But all three kind of sit together and are living in some of the things we're talking about today. Yeah. Now I'm going to really land the plane. And then I'm going to turn this over to Keith. I want to encourage us to just read the Bible. Thinking about Acts and disruption. In Acts 8, Philip gets disrupted and ends up out on the road to Gaza and encounters an Ethiopian court official, the eunuch. And there's that moment as they're engaging in conversation over Scripture that the eunuch says, well, here's water. Now, I don't know how he found water on the geyser, but there was water. What, you remember what the language is? What prevents me or hinders me, right? Now, here's a sneaky thing I think Luke's doing. I did some sneaky stuff with Matthew. Here's some sneaky stuff Luke's doing. That's the first of 7 times, as I count them, that he uses that word in this document. In the second, part 2, right, of Luke's corpus. He says it again with Peter when he's at Cornelius's house. Well, the Spirit showed up. What? I'm not going to hinder the Spirit. Hinder. You can check it out. But what I find really striking is that's the way in which Luke lands the plane for the book of Acts. Talking about Paul. He lived there, Paul did, 2 whole years at his own expense, and welcomed all who came to him, proclaiming the kingdom of God. Hey, we talked about that, didn't we? Announcing the kingdom of God. And teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ. We talked about that too. With all boldness and without being hindered. What I think Luke may be trying to telegraph to us is that when God's in work in something, ain't nothing going to get in the way. I'm inviting you as church leaders to remember that simple, central conviction of our faith and our calling, that God is the leader, and our task is to pay attention and let him do the work that he wants to do. Thanks for letting me be a part of this today.